You think about development, you also have to think a little bit about design and where things are headed and what Detroit could look like in the next 50 years. And joining me now to have that conversation is Olga Stella. She is the Executive Director of the Detroit Creative Corridor Center. It's always good to see you, Olga.
Thanks so much for having me, Christy.
And also John Gallagher, and he is a writer, business writer with Detroit Free Press. And John, I have followed your work for a number of years. You've always written a lot about design and development. And so that's why I thought, gosh, when I want to have this conversation, I wanted to have the two of you, and of course, in looking back, you've actually written a lot about DC3 and the work that Olga is doing there. So I want to start off, I guess, with the idea, Olga, that, and I picked this up from, I think, some of the conversations that you had, is how does good design kind of, I mean, shape a city?
Right. So when we think about all the different ways that design can impact a city, we think about it from the perspective of job creation, place, and culture. And maybe we can start with place. I mean, it is design influences the places people want to be, whether it's the buildings, the way those spaces are laid out, how welcoming they feel, and whether they're inclusive, whether they're really accessible to people. And then the value creation in businesses, whether it's a service that a business is offering, a product a business is offering, design is often that intangible that ultimately drives whether or not customers are going to buy it, whether they're going to come back, refer others, and begin to create those kinds of business opportunities. But ultimately, it also shapes our culture and the way that we attack problems and look at the issues that face us and how we prototype and test solutions to those problems. And I think we see all of those things happening in Detroit, and we believe that it can happen at a far larger scale.
And Detroit has such a storied history when it comes to design, John. But it almost feels like now that we are at this space where there's so much development that's happening from so many different kinds of entities, how do we make sure that it's all coordinated and we're kind of on a shared vision of what we want the city to look like?
Well, I'm not sure it has to be, all from the same hymn book. I think in mid-20th century, you had Motown music charting all those great hits. You had Ford Motor Company doing the Mustang. You had great architecture from Eero Saarinen and Minoru Yamasaki, and they didn't necessarily coordinate with each other, but there was sort of an atmosphere that welcomed really good design.
Yeah.
And I think we're back to that now. And I think one question for Olga is, good design simply a matter of money? You pay more, you get good design, or is it something more about the process so that you don't have to pay a lot to get good design?
And we would land on process. I think people go to design as a luxury item, and that it does have to be something that's expensive, and then it feels inaccessible and like, well, maybe it's not for me. Maybe it's for those people downtown, or those people who have different access to resources. But I do think that good design is about process and even how maybe using the materials that are available to us. There's some really interesting things happening in Detroit with the upcycling of materials, with folks using materials that are available to them to create solutions for bus stops, for seating, for shelter. And so it doesn't have to be expensive.
And I think that's an interesting point to make. But how do you also connect to people saying, "Gosh, design? Why are we even worried about that? We just need to get like bricks and mortar. I just need a grocery store here." Or how do you get people to kind of see a little bit of the whole picture or understand that?
So we're trying to peel back the layers of the onion. So a grocery store is a great example. Lots of folks point to Detroit and say, oh, there are no grocery stores in Detroit. Actually, there are a lot of over 70 grocery stores in Detroit. But when you drive by them, you can't tell they're a grocery store because of the exterior of that design. The parking lot's not welcoming. There's no windows. The signage is deceiving. All of those things are design solutions. There's design challenges where there's a design solution. And so at the heart of it, when we start to look at the different issues that face us, whether it's our education system, neighborhood revitalization, stormwater drainage, you start to pull that apart. You can find both design challenges and interventions that can make a difference. Our challenge is that most people in our community don't know how to name it. And they don't really realize that what they're talking about is design.
Would you say that's some of the challenges, John, or how would you comment on what?
Oh, sure. I agree completely. I think one of the reasons why we got in trouble with bad design for several decades is that sort of the bean counters took over. I mean, it was strictly a financial decision. If it costs too much, we cut it out.
Yeah.
And I think design didn't even have a place at the table. As Olga said, there wasn't a voice for design on a lot of these issues. So now it's coming back, and you just have to, agitate to make sure people pay attention to this.
And part of our challenge is showing that value. Yeah, maybe it requires some investment up front, but there's a return on that investment over the long run. And if you don't invest in it, then what do we get? Drab places that nobody wants to be in, products that no one wants to buy. Investing a little bit on the front end yields to returns on the long run.
John, how would you describe the city of Detroit in the last 5 years in terms of development and changes?
Well, it's been coming along remarkably compared to the previous 35 years. The last 5 years we've seen so much happening and so much interest in design, both in architecture and artists putting murals all over the city, and public street art, and just music festivals of all kinds. And so I think we really are paying attention to it in a new way. We don't always put it under the rubric of design, quote design. It comes from a lot of different things. It comes from urban planning and streetscape and placemaking and music and art. But we're paying a lot more attention to it. I just think the city of Detroit, in the neighborhoods too, has just gotten so much more interesting to look at and to be at in the last 5 years than it had been for a long, long time.
That's right.
And I think it's interesting that you add, we've got the city planning department that's working, and you have, financial investment from Rock, and they have their own kind of planners for the properties that they have and for the things that they have. There has to be some kind of coordination, but you almost say that sometimes it has to be organically occurring in other places. I want you both to comment on that.
Yeah, and so we do think there should be some kind of coordination, and so that's the work that we're trying to do with this visioning process that we've started. Not to say everyone has to do exactly the same thing, but if we're looking down the road and there's a goal that we want to point to, how can the things that we're doing individually as businesses or organization add up to that goal, and what are the values, frankly, that we all want to espouse that might help us along the way, because lots of things are going to change over the next 10 years. But if we have some framework that we're working in, maybe we can work better together to try to get down that road.
And I would say that instead of coordination, I might say inspiration. There needs to be a common inspiration.
I agree.
Some coordination. Obviously, the city for planning has to have its act together. But I think more of a common inspiration that we're going to welcome good design, whether it's in architecture or streetscape or murals at Eastern Market, or new trees in the neighborhoods or something. There has to be this welcoming spirit for design.
I agree 100%.
All right, Olga, last question here. Next 6 months for DC3, what do you guys have in the works?
Oh my gosh, so we're building this vision with our partners and figuring out what an economic development strategy around design looks like that really is about inclusive, equitable growth. And so I'm really excited about what that means, both for the services that we provide, but hopefully for the ways that we can partner and inspire, a lot of partners in the community to do their part too.
All right, well, we'll be watching to see what happens next. Olga, Stella, thanks so much.
Thank
also,
you.
John Gallagher, we love reading you in the Free. Thanks so much for coming on.